This week on Life and Faith.
Never will I forget the cry, she writes. The cry, and then the silence. And she uses that as a refrain to talk about women's lives. The cry, the fall, the silence.
It's really infuriating because 10% of pregnancies are not normal.
I was giving up on this whole thing of faith.
Within a year, all of the wedding china was smashed.
Life is not made of straight lines.
Change the paradigm.
Welcome to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. I'm Simon Smart. Now, to mark International Women's Day, which is happening this week, we're bringing you a conversation from a few years back with a friend of CPX and one of our favourite historians, Sarah Williams. Sarah is a lecturer at Regent College in Vancouver and is a research associate at St Benet's Hall in Oxford. In this interview, Sarah introduces us to someone she calls her friend, even though they lived in different centuries. This woman has been called the mother of modern feminism, but somehow she's fallen off the pages of history, and many of us have never heard of her. All the more reason to rebroadcast this episode. Natasha Moore got to have this conversation with Sarah Williams. Here's Natasha.
If I ask you to imagine a revolutionary, what or who do you picture? Whatever springs to mind, it probably won't have much in common with Josephine Butler. Many of her contemporaries thought her the most beautiful woman in the world. She was related to Earl Grey, who was the British Prime Minister for a while and who, yes, the tea is named after. But she spent much of her life in the company of the despised and forgotten and exploited women of her generation, shunned by friends, getting death threats from powerful enemies. Sarah Williams has been spending a lot of time with Josephine Butler over the last couple of years.
She's a British woman, born in 1828, died in 1906, and she's widely considered to be the mother of modern feminism. Really one of the major shaping forces of the women's movement in Britain. A first wave Christian feminist for whom her feminism arose out of her understanding of what it says in the Bible about men and women.
Why haven't we heard of her?
I had not heard of her, even though I did an undergraduate history degree, because for a really long time she's fallen right off the pages of history. Because for secular feminists writing after the war, she was just a tad too Christian. Couldn't quite make sense of how Christianity and feminism might go together. But for people who are often looking for Christian heroes in the past, she was just a tad too feminist. And so she fell between those two stools for a very long time, but not anymore. So all of a sudden, Butler is front and centre of almost every bibliography on 19th and early 20th century because of the recognition of her extraordinary influence in the area of human trafficking. And I think there's a growing recognition that a problem that she talked about in the 19th century is still with us in highly complex ways, particularly the trafficking of young girls and boys internationally. And that's something that Josephine Butler was very involved in bringing to light.
Butler might have been too feminist for later Christians and too Christian for later feminists, but the causes she lent her energy and influence to have changed the course of history. She campaigned for women's suffrage. She helped open up opportunities for women in higher education. Her culture said it was inappropriate for respectable women to even know about the seedier realities of life, let alone talk about them in public. Butler, though, uncovered sex trafficking rings. She worked to abolish child prostitution and helped to get the age of consent raised from 13 to 16 years of age. In 1869, she started a long campaign against what was called the Contagious Diseases Acts. These were laws that Parliament introduced to try to deal with the rates of venereal disease, of STIs, in the armed forces. Instead of addressing the behaviour of the men involved, the laws authorised police to arrest women they suspected of being prostitutes and force them to undergo a medical examination that Butler described as surgical rape. If they were found to be infected, they could be interned, locked up in a hospital for up to a year. When I asked Sarah what she finds remarkable about Josephine Butler, this campaign is what comes up.
I think the first thing I find truly remarkable about her is her singular persistence to change one law over a 16-year period. And I find that really extraordinary, because I don't think that we lack vision in our culture, but we definitely lack stamina. And I lack stamina. Like, what would it be like to work on one thing? Now, of course, there were myriad elements to that one thing, but with a singular focus for 16 years without giving up and thinking this is just not going to happen. And in a way, what's most remarkable about her is it's that act of persistence that creates the momentum that builds towards the recognition of the constitutional rights of women in Britain, most certainly. And so the perseverance itself is remarkable, but it does remarkable things to persevere.
How did she do it?
I think she did it by recognising that she couldn't do it. Does that sound strange? Probably. First of all, she recognised that she couldn't do it without the help of God, that she had to do it with God, not on her own. And so for her, the practice of prayer, not just asking God for help, but actually being with God and finding strength in God, was the primary practice of her life. And out of that, really, all her political practices flow. And so that was the source, I think that was the source of her strength in a way. But then the other thing was that she worked in community, and she prayed with other women for some women over 30 years. She had groups of women who prayed for her, that she prayed for. They helped each other. They gave each other wisdom in letters. They talked over problems. They might have a certain young woman that they were helping getting out of the sex traffic and trying to find alternative forms of employment for. And so they would help each other through these networks of prayer to find employment for women. They weren't just networks of passive prayer. Sometimes we think of prayer as a very passive act. But actually they were prayer that was action, that resulted in action, but was in itself action and transformative, inviting women who've been in the sex trade into finding out what it might mean to learn to pray.
A rallying cry of second-wave feminism was, "The personal is political." It's a motto that you could use as well to describe Butler's life and character. It's true of the way that her deep friendships with women on the margins of society fed into her activism. It's also true of the way that she processed the greatest grief of her life. In 1859, her 6-year-old daughter Eva fell over a banister at their home to her death.
It was a major defining point in her life. "Never will I forget the cry," she writes. The cry, and then the silence. The fall, and then the silence. And it becomes a refrain, the cry, the fall, the silence. And she uses that as a refrain to talk about women's lives. The cry, the fall, the silence of women who've been experiencing the life of the outcast, what Victorian culture would call fallen women. And she begins to talk about her own loss of her own daughter becoming a mother to women who had been outcast. And so there's an extraordinary way in which that she brought, for example, one young woman by the name of Mary Lomax into her home and nursed her for 6 months and then buried her. And her own little niece, her favourite sister Harriet, who she had lots of time with, her daughter, Harriet's daughter, Josephine Butler's niece, died on a visit to England, and they buried the little niece right next to Mary Lomax in a family space. And that idea that somehow the death of a child can make a mother of you, that there can be a death and rebirth. And of course, but I've lost a child not as old as that, but at birth, in a stillbirth. And so there's a part of me that can resonate with what it's like to lose a daughter, and how that, experience can be a transformative experience that's painful, but transformative and hopeful.
Yeah, so what has Josephine Butler meant personally for you?
She's a friend. So I think I love the bit in the Apostles' Creed. I believe in the communion of saints. And I suppose for me, the idea that I can find friendship with the people of God through time, solidarity with the people of God through time, and that they can help me find my strength in God by knowing about their lives, by studying them, by reading what they wrote, by reading about the way that they nearly lost the plot sometimes, but how they fought the good fight of faith with perseverance. And just have found it enormously inspiring. And I think that there are parts of me I can relate to her. So actually being able to find a friend that is not so dissimilar to me, that as I can sort of go, I can see how she loved the life of the mind and how she loved to learn and she loved to find out about history, and she loved Catherine of Siena from the 14th century. I like Catherine of Siena from the 15th century. So it's like we got shared interest with the same kind of, and you don't always get that in life. And so finding friendship with somebody who truly inspires me, I want to be like her, I would like to know more about her and let her inspire my life. We're good at tearing leaders down in our culture, but finding leaders we can say, I'd like to be like them. They're not perfect, but they imitate Christ, so I can imitate them as they imitate Christ. It's good.
Are there ways that Josephine Butler looks like or doesn't look like what we would call an activist, what she might call a reformer?
From about 1870 onwards, she was different from how we'd think about an activist because she wasn't angry. She somehow learned to do something extraordinary, which is to express anger and grief in prayer to God. And that seems to have found a way of enabling her to occupy this terribly difficult space of speaking up for the marginalised and those who've been unjustly treated in society, but to do it in a way that was gentle. And I think that that's what comes out when people remember her, when she used to stand up in public, which was an unusual thing for women to do in those days. And they were used to women being shrill. When she would stand up in public, and there was a kind of quality of quietness about her, composed in a core. It was extremely powerful. It wasn't just the absence of energy, but it wasn't anger. And I think to be able to meet injustice in the world calmly, straightforwardly and truthfully, without the edge of anger where that injustice is more overwhelming than the good behind what might come out of that through resolution. I find that very inspiring, really. And that makes her different from many activists, because even today, there's this layer sometimes in me. I get angry when I see injustice. But it impresses me that somebody would persevere in tackling injustice without allowing their own sort of heart, their own spirit to become so angry that they've become polluted by it somehow.
This is Life and Faith from CPX, and Natasha is speaking with Sarah Williams about a woman who was described shortly after her death as one of the great people of the world. The world is different because she lived, which really raises a broader question.
If we pull back and think about that whole idea of changing the world, which is a thing we sort of talk about quite a lot now, and we argue a lot about how you change the world, how you should go about that. Is that even the right question, do you think?
I think it matters a lot how we imagine what we mean when we talk about trying to change the world. And it's sort of interrogating our categories there is really, really important. Because, of course, we all have a theory of change. You can't operate without a theory of change. The very idea of trying to do something good that everybody wants to do, most people want to do, you have to operate by a grid of what you mean by that and how you actually go about influencing and changing other people or enacting a vision. So knowing what our theory of change is, what is our social imaginary, how do we believe that cultures change, is really, really, really important, because change and power, change and influence often get correlated in certain ways, in the way we imagine. So, for example, we might imagine that the real centres of power are where powerful people change culture through influencing spheres of culture, like often media, politics, the law, and so on. And we build up this core periphery phenomenon in our heads. Here are the centres and here are the margins. And somewhere on the margins lie all the uninfluential people and the uninfluential spheres, like ordinary homes maybe, or schools that have got to the bottom of the pile of the rankings, or wherever those places are on the margins of our imaginations. And yet what's extraordinary about somebody like Josephine Butler or Mahatma Gandhi or any other of the great social reformers that we can think of in history is that they somehow managed to see that really the margins matter a lot. And that what goes on at the centre, if it fails to understand what's going on at the margins, does so at its peril. And we're seeing that in all sorts of places, even in the world at the moment. So having a social vision where we can think about power in different ways, think about agency in myriad different ways, and think about creativity and cultural creativity in ways which mobilise everybody to be involved in the project of what it means to live together well in society, would be a more healthy model than simply thinking that somehow you've got to get to the top of the pile before you can start influencing, and that somehow we should leave the influencing to this kind of elite group of people who have these special skills and special gifts and special charism.
One of the striking things about Josephine Butler's activism is how central the practice of prayer was to it. I asked Sarah about this. As a Christian, of course, she believes that prayer itself is achieving something because God is involved. But I was wondering, looking at it from a secular historian perspective, can prayer have an impact on the world? And if so, how?
Let me give a really embodied example of that. So, for example, I've been talking about how Josephine Butler practiced prayer and how she practiced prayer in networks of friendship with other people that middle-class women didn't normally spend time with. And when two people from entirely different social spaces, different experiences of life, sit next to each other and pray together as perfect equals to God, it reframes the imagination. And what began to happen in the work that Butler did over that 16-year period when she was working to change the laws, the contagious diseases legislation, is that women who were very hostile to Christianity looked in at those networks and were astounded by them. And up until that time, the women's reform movement was very much centred on the middle class. It had a very particular codified way of going about emphasising education for middle-class women. And there was absolutely no imaginary around the idea that working-class women, for example, might get the vote, or that working-class women might be educated. It was one thing you want to reform for the middle-class respectable women, but the idea that women at the bottom of the pile could also participate together in talking about injustice and the need for reform in society, it was Butler's initiative to create these networks of prayer which don't fake anything. Because the thing is about prayer is it's not, you can fake prayer. I've faked prayer. We can fake prayer, right? You can pull your flag up and do your civic prayer. But when you're talking to God, it's not a great idea to fake it. Right? So if you start to think about prayer as actual communion with a living person who is in dialogue, not only listening but also speaking, and then you put into dialogue 2 people with God or 20 people with God, and you start to reframe everything about the way that community begins to function. And so as Butler created these extraordinary networks of prayer, she created what Walter Brueggemann, for example, talks about as an alternative social and political consciousness. She creates another way of imagining what feminine power could even begin to look like.
Final question, two-parter. I want to ask what advice you'd give to young people in particular who want to go out and change the world, and also to women who want the same thing.
Well, Butler went to speak in 1879 to a group of Cambridge undergraduates, all of them male, who did want to do exactly that, go out and change the world. And she gave them only one piece of advice: learn how to be alone. If you want to be in society, you want to influence society for the good, then learn how to be alone with God. And so her advice to them was, yeah, get your education, yeah, get your skills. But if you want to train one practice in your life that will change everything for the whole of your life, spend your youth learning how to pray. That's exactly what Butler did. She started the practice of prayer in her late teens. She used to sometimes spend whole nights in prayer because her days, she said, were too busy. And it's so simple, but it is the most difficult thing, especially for young people to do. Because when we talk about being bombarded, that word doesn't come anywhere near to the fragmentation of the human person and the human mind, and concentration and visual power, everything that's going on, sort of as it were phenomenologically, in terms of the technological changes that we're going through in terms of social media. It's changing everything about people's realities in many ways. So the idea that you would withdraw into a quiet, solitary space without noise and without a phone for a prolonged period of time might just be the most revolutionary act that a young person can do these days, or an older person like me can do these days, right? It's a practice of resistance.
Is there anything you want to say to women in particular about their influence on the world, or potential influence?
I think the greatest tragedy of the women's movement, if you were going back in time to 1890 and projecting forward in time, the greatest tragedy is that so often women feel or behave either that they have to become like men or behave like men in order to be in positions of influence and power. And the sad thing is that although we've got women into positions, we've concentrated our efforts on that. What we haven't done so well is to question whether our categories of power, our ways of defining power, what we mean by power and influence, were good categories to have in the first place. And we've created competitive units, both male and female, instead of allowing for the possibility that women's influence and men's influence might actually be to say, hold on a minute, is that really how we want to influence? And so somehow we've got to find a way, I think, and I think we do have a really interesting and I think potentially extraordinarily formative way as women to be able to say, it doesn't have to be like this. I don't have to perform like this. I don't have to be productive like this. I don't have to be an object of labour in a labour market, for example. I could cease to be a commodity. I might want to live in a different way. And I think women in some ways have still, for historic reasons, a degree of freedom in defining, which might in fact be even more difficult for men in our culture. So I think we've got to be willing to lead. It might mean that we sound politically incorrect. I don't think we have to sound politically correct. I just think we have to think of some new language to talk about things differently.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Natasha Moore. We hope you enjoyed revisiting with us this conversation about activism and anger and power and prayer. Sarah Williams' biography of her friend, Josephine Butler, is due out later this year. I'm sure you'd know someone who needs to hear about Josephine Butler, so do share this conversation with them. We'd also love you to subscribe to Life and Faith and leave us a rating or review. Also, the podcast is only one of the things we do here at CPX, and if you'd like to know a bit more about our work, go to our website, publicchristianity.org, and sign up to our newsletter, which gives you a fortnightly update on what's going on. Our thanks, as always, go to our producer, the prayerful Alan Douthwaite. Next week.
One of your own countrymen, Nick Cave, is quite an interesting example here, who published this memoir recently, Hope, Faith and Carnage. Reading that memoir, hearing what he's been saying, he's obviously feeling something very deeply about the Christian story that for him is resonating in all kinds of ways.